كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, so far we've discussed a lot of rulings relating to the dowry. We started off with discussing the minimum amount of dowry, and then we moved on to various scenarios and their rulings. So, what happens when the man stipulates the dowry? What happens when the man doesn't stipulate the dowry? Can a man, after he has stipulated the dowry during the marriage contract, can he increase the dowry afterwards? We've also discussed the fact that she can reduce the dowry afterwards. And then we moved on to the ruling on seclusion and how it relates to the amount of dowry that is due upon him. Alhamdulillah, these are what's been discussed so far. In today's lesson, inshallah, we'll be discussing further rulings relating to the dowry. So we're going to start off with a discussion of mut'ah, the parting gift of gratification. In what scenarios is it merely recommended? And in what scenarios is it an obligation to give her the mut'ah? We'll also be discussing other scenarios in relation to this. So, how much dowry is due when the man mentions something as dowry that is invalid? For example, he mentions that he will teach her or he will serve her, he will be in her service for 1 year. That's not a valid dowry. So, how much dowry will be due in that scenario? And various other scenarios relating to when the dowry is invalid. And we'll also learn that that doesn't have any impact, any influence on the marriage contract itself. So when the principle we'll learn is that when there is an invalid condition within the marriage, that invalid condition will be ignored. That's not going to be taken into account, and the marriage will remain valid. We'll then mention the ruling of when a woman stipulates a condition in the marriage contract and the man fails to fulfill that condition, the fact that if in the case that he fails, how much dowry would be due? She'll receive the customary dowry. So that's a condition in the marriage contract that he fails to fulfill. We'll mention that as well. And then we'll end off, inshallah, with the discussion of mentioning such an item as dowry that is obscure, that's not being specified. So what happens in that case as well? In the first ruling of today's lesson, Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayhi addresses something which we've hinted to earlier, and that is the fact that there are various scenarios where the gift of gratification, when he has divorced her, is voluntary, i.e., it's not an obligation, it's a recommendation upon him to give her. And there is one scenario wherein it's an obligation upon him to give her the mut'ah, the gift of gratification. So Imam Quduri says the gift of gratification is recommended for every divorcee except for one type of divorcee, and that is she whom someone divorces prior to consummation of the marriage without specifying the amount of her dowry. So which scenarios is Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayhi referring to? There are various types, and he is referring to the types we've mentioned earlier. So let's take one example, the scenario wherein he has stated and stipulated the dowry, and he has consummated the marriage. What's due on him is the entire stipulated dowry. But even in that case as well, the gift of gratification would be recommended to give, even though he's giving the entire dowry. Another scenario is he hasn't mentioned anything, no stipulation of dowry, but he's consummated the marriage. So while in that case, he's giving her the customary dowry, even in that case, the gift of gratification would be recommended to give. So these are a few scenarios. I'm just highlighting the fact that it is referring to those scenarios we've been discussing earlier. Now I'm going to mention the scenario, that one type of divorcee who receives the gift of gratification as an obligation, not just a recommendation, but an obligation that he must give her. And that is she whom he divorces prior to consummation of the marriage without specifying her dowry. So when he married her in the marriage contract, he hasn't stipulated the dowry. And then going forward in the marriage, he hadn't really consummated the marriage, nor has he engaged in seclusion with her, a valid seclusion which would allow them to consummate the marriage. So in that case, the gift of gratification would be an obligation upon him. So this is that one type. There is another type, however, which has not been mentioned here, and that is when the separation between them is initiated or is because of her. She has caused a separation, and he is forced to, or he is compelled to divorce her. So the divorce has come because of her. In that case, all she will receive is the gift of gratification, which would be due upon him, not an obligation, not a recommendation, but an obligation upon him towards her. So this is one other scenario which has not been mentioned here, but I just thought I'll mention that as well. Another discussion in relation to this is the amount of this gift of gratification. And we've mentioned earlier, it's those clothings, those three types of clothing. And what if there's a dispute that he says that I'm going to give you this much, and she says it should be more than that. I deserve this much. So the scholars have said that it's really, in essence, based on his affluence and financial capacity. It's not just whatever she feels. Yes, it's based on the customary clothing of women, but it's also depends on his affluence and his financial capacity. So whatever he is able to give her. And again, in cases of dispute, there will still be dispute. So to quantify this, the scholars have said that it should not go anywhere below the minimum amount of dowry, that is 10 dirhams, and it should not go above half of the customary dowry. So mahrul mithl is a certain amount, but half of that, the gift of gratification should not exceed half of the customary dowry. So this is the discussion in relation to the mut'ah, and this is the main detail that we have been anticipating. Furthermore, Imam Qudur rahmatullahi alayh, he addresses another discussion where he says, when a man marries off his daughter on the condition that the other man will marry his daughter, the other man will marry his sister, or his daughter to him, so that one of the contracts of marriage becomes a consideration for the other contract, then both contracts are valid, and each of the two brides is entitled to the customary dowry. Each of the two brides is entitled to the customary dowry. So this is a scenario wherein there is no actual dowry that's been stipulated. Rather, what they've actually decided on, almost as a dowry, is something else. So he says to the other man, I'm going to give you my daughter for you to marry her on the condition that you give me your daughter, or I'll marry your sister, you marry my sister. So it's almost as though I'm not going to give you an actual dowry, but the dowry would be, if anything, the dowry would be that I'm going to give you my sister. And my sister's dowry would be your marriage, and your sister's dowry would be my marriage. And so basically, each of the others' marriage will be almost a dowry for the other one. So the question is this something that is valid? So Imam Quduri says that the nikah contract will remain valid. And the principle which we've mentioned earlier is that just because there is an invalid condition within the marriage contract does not mean that the marriage itself becomes invalid. So here the condition is this kind of dowry that they've come up with, that is invalid, It's a condition that is invalid, but it does not influence the validity of the nikah or the marriage contract itself. What would be due, however, is that each of the brides in those cases will get the customary dowry. As we've seen earlier, in the case of the man telling her that your dowry would be wine or a pig. So as we said that in those cases, the dowry of wine or a pig, it's not really a valuable item, and what she must receive as dowry should be a valuable item. So similar is this case where he hasn't really given her a valuable item, because of which the customary dowry would be due. In the next one, Imam Quduri addresses something very similar to this. He says, if a free man marries a woman on the condition of his service to her for a year, or on the condition of teaching the Quran to her, it is permitted, and she is still entitled to the customary dowry. This is something we've mentioned earlier as well, that the condition here is an invalid condition, but it does not mean that the marriage itself will be invalidated. And this is what Imam Quduri expresses by saying jaza, which means here it is valid. A lot of times people translate jaza as permitted. While that is correct in many cases, it is not always the case that is permitted. Rather, the expression here is referring to validity of this marriage contract. And so when doing this kind of thing, the condition will be invalid, but the marriage will be valid. And so she will receive the customary dowry. Even though a person's service to somebody working for somebody, people pay for this, but that itself is not a valuable item for dowry. And similarly, people will, teaching Quran is a greatly rewardable act, and people pay for this. But still, because that itself is not a valuable item, it's not considered a valuable item, that's why that will not be a valid dowry, because of which we will resort to the customary dowry. The next ruling is closely linked to the previous scenario. Imam Quduri rahimahullah ta'ala says, if a slave marries a free woman with the permission of his master on the condition of his service to her for a year, it is valid, and she is entitled to that service from him. So first thing is that we're going to learn that a slave can only get married with the consent of his master. Similarly, a slave girl can only get married with the consent of her master. They are not allowed to get married without their consent. And here we can see the contrast between this one and the previous scenario, where Imam Quduri says that although it is valid for a free person to say that the dowry to his wife is his service to her, the marriage contract will be valid, but she will automatically be due the customary dowry. In here, however, if a slave decides to serve her and say that your dowry is my service to you, that is valid, and he will do her service as her dowry. Now, the difference between the two is, of course, the fact that this is a slave, and that up there is regarding a free person. And the reason for this is that when a slave decides to say that I'm going to do your service, because he himself is a commodity, a slave himself is a commodity. So when he serves his wife, it's as though he is presenting himself to her. And he can do this because he is a commodity. And now, as dowry, she's receiving something of value. Now, this is not the case when it comes to a free person. Why? Because a free person is not a commodity. So when he says that I'm going to serve you, I'm going to teach you, I'm going to do this service for you, in essence, a service is not an item of value. So that goes against mal, something of value. So when the free person does this, he's almost presenting himself to her as dowry, which he cannot do because he himself cannot become, he himself is not a commodity, he's a free person. And as we said, this is not the case for a slave. So this is the difference between the two rulings. And now Imam Quduri says, when in the case of an insane woman, her father and her son are both present, then the guardian for her marriage contract is her son, according to Imams Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf rahimahumullah. But Imam Muhammad rahimahullah said that the guardian is her father. So this is a case in particular regarding a woman who is insane. Now, in her case, she has a father and a son who are both her guardians. As we learned previously, there is a hierarchy in terms of who can become a guardian first before the other in a woman's marriage. So we almost hinted towards the fact that first comes the son and then the grandson, etc. And then the father and of course also those above him, the grandfather, etc. And then it goes sideways towards the brother, etc. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah says that, and Imam Abu Yusuf, they both say that even in the case of an insane woman, we will be following the hierarchy which we addressed in the previous rulings, that first comes the son. In the presence of their son, the father cannot marry her off. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah says that the father will marry her off, even if the son is there. So he goes against this hierarchy that we learned earlier. And the preponderant view is the view of Imams Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, which means that according to this view, if the father marries her off whilst the son is present, then if she happens to later become sane, she loses that insanity and she becomes sane again, then she has the right to annul the marriage. Why? Because the son was the immediate guardian. The son was first in the hierarchy and then it was the father, but the father had married her off. As opposed to when the son marries her off and she later becomes sane again, she would not have that right to annul the marriage. And of course, the ruling would be different according to Imam Muhammad's view, but that's not the preponderant view. Now, moving on. The marriage contract of a slave or a slave woman is not allowed except with the permission of their master. In essence, a slave can only get married if the master gives permission to do so. Now, why is that the case? This is because the master has rights over the slave. The slave is in full-time service towards the master, and now getting married without the master's permission means that the slave now incurs more responsibility upon himself, which he can't do. His bucket is full. He can't really do any more service because he's in 24-hour service towards the master. Now, getting married to someone means that the spouse now has rights towards the slave. How can the slave who gets married without the master's consent fulfill the master's rights as well as the spouse's rights? So this is, of course, there's going to be a clash here. And that's why the simple way out of this the only way out of this is that the slave gets married with the master's consent. Put it this way. If we have an employee, a full-time employee who decides, let me start a side hustle, and then this side hustle becomes such a thing which the employee engages and becomes so engrossed that they start engaging in those tasks to continue their side hustle during the hours of their full-time employment. Now, of course, they're either going to be doing this or that. They can't be doing what they've been given to the task they've been given by the employer as well as the side hustle. Of course, the employer will not be happy at all about the idea that this employee becomes busy in other things besides what they've been employed to do during these hours. So similar is the case here where the master will not be happy with the slave who gets married without the consent of the master, simply because they'll be busy in other things besides the master's service. And that's why the slave cannot get married without the master's permission. Moving on now, Imam Quduri says, when a slave marries with the permission of his master, then the dowry is a debt upon him for which he may be sold. Now, here we have a case of a slave getting married, and he gets married with the master's permission. Now he has to give dowry because he's gotten married. The question that arises here is, how does he give his wife any dowry when he's a slave and he owns nothing? The concept here is that a slave owns nothing. All of his wealth is the wealth of the master. So the basic concept to understand here is that the master has given permission for the slave to get married. So there will be some sort of liability on the master in relation to the dowry that's owed to the slave's wife. So firstly, what will be told to the master is that allow the, either you give the dowry on behalf of the slave to his wife, or you allow the slave to earn some money, go and work and earn some money so that the slave can pay off that dowry to the wife. And if the master refuses to do any of these things, then he will be compelled, there will be some sort of a court settlement where he will be compelled to sell that slave off. And then from the gains of that sale, he will be made to give the dowry to the wife. Let's say, for example, the slave is worth £200 and the dowry to the wife is £100. So £100 will be gone as dowry and the master can keep the rest of the £100. And if that doesn't work, for example, if the slave is, Maidani mentions an additional point. He says that if that doesn't work, let's say the slave is sold for £200 and his dowry to his wife is £400. Now, of course, the master will not get anything in this case. The dowry, £200 of the cost of the slave will go to that as dowry. And how about the remaining £200? Maidani in his Lubab, he mentions an additional point. He says that in such a case, he will not be sold twice, meaning the new master will not be compelled to sell the slave. Rather, what will happen is that dowry will be a debt on the slave, and later on in his life, he will have to ensure that he pays off that dowry. When a master gives away his slave woman in marriage, he is not liable to accommodate her in her husband's house. Rather, she shall continue to serve her master. It will be said to the husband, whenever you find an opportunity with her, you may have intimacy with her. This is a case where the slave girl has gotten married. Now the master has given her permission to get married. And the person who she's got married to hasn't yet taken her in his house. Why? Because the master hasn't given her permission. Now, is the master responsible of providing her or allowing her to move and live with the husband? No. The basic ruling that's being mentioned here is that it's not the master's responsibility. Rather, the master can still seek her service. And what's going to be said to the husband is that whenever you have an opportunity with her, you can engage in intimacy with her. But otherwise, yes, the husband has this right to have intimacy, but this is only when the slave girl is free from the master's service, whenever the husband can find this opportunity. So this is the basic ruling, that it's not the master's liability. The master is not liable to accommodate her or allow her to go. Remember that this is a case where if he allows her to go to live with the husband, then he will no longer be able to seek her service as her master. But if he does tell her to live with him, the master, then in that case, she will be able to, she can serve him. Maidani in his Lubab, he mentions an additional ruling that is closely related to this. He says that the wife will receive maintenance from her husband if she lives with him. Of course, the default ruling is that it's the husband's responsibility to provide for her maintenance. So any cost that's incurred and any expenses on her, that's the husband's responsibility to fulfill those basic necessities. But in this case, where the master hasn't allowed her to move in with the husband is no longer liable to give her that maintenance because she's not living with him. But yes, if the master does allow her to live with him, then the husband's responsibility of providing her maintenance comes back at once again. Let's take the example to understand this properly of the employee again. The employee, for example, you have Abdullah, an employee, his work is very flexible. He can go on site to work and he can work from home as well. If he chooses to work on site, then the business will take care of his food, his electricity, the water and coffee that he drinks. You know, his food, he can have it from the canteen and it's going to be free of charge. But if he works from home, he can no longer claim that I want my food from the canteen because he's working from home. So the flexibility is there that he can go and work on site, then a lot of things are going to be paid for. But if he works from home, none of those things are going to be paid for. So likewise, this slave girl, if she is living with the husband, then she can receive that maintenance. If she hasn't got permission to live with the husband, then she will not receive the maintenance that's usually on the husband. So this is the basic ruling that's been mentioned here, however, to understand this, that the master is not liable to accommodate them. He can still seek her service. Remember, this is not seeking the service of intimacy. The master cannot engage in intimacy with the slave girl. Why? Because now she is married. Now he can no longer have intimacy with her because she is married to someone. Now she's going to have intimacy with the husband. If someone marries a woman for 1,000 dirhams on the condition that he will not take her out of the city, or on the condition that he will not marry another woman during their marriage, and then if he fulfills the condition, she is entitled to the specified dowry. But if he does marry during the marriage, or if he takes her out of the city, then she is entitled to the customary dowry. So this is where the woman stipulates the condition that he cannot marry somebody else during their marriage, or he cannot take her out of her city where her parents are, for example. So there is a condition here. Let's say Abdul Rahman says that I'm getting married to you, Khadija, and your dowry is £5,000. She says, yes, but I make this condition that you cannot take me outside of London, for example, or on the condition that you cannot get married to somebody else. Now, let's say 1 year later, Abdul Rahman decides to move with her to another city, to Birmingham, for example. Or Abdul Rahman decides to get married to somebody else. Now, he hasn't really fulfilled the condition that was stipulated during the marriage contract. Now, what he would need to do is not just the £5,000 she is due as the stipulated dowry, but he would need to top it up to the customary dowry. Let's say the customary dowry in her case is £7,000. He would need to top up that extra £2,000 to make it £7,000. Why? Because he hasn't fulfilled the condition here. Now, there is something similar what happens in our societies where women stipulate this condition, thinking that this condition is, he is obligated now. He is obliged to fulfill that condition. And they seem to think that if he doesn't fulfill the condition, then automatically a divorce occurs. This is not true. How does a divorce occur? And yes, a divorce cannot occur just like that. And what is the procedure for divorce will be discussed in the chapters of divorce, inshallah. Now moving on to the next one. If someone marries her for an unspecified animal, let's say he says a goat, but what kind of goat? What is the breed of the goat? How old is the goat? What color is the goat? The nomination of the unspecified animal is valid, and she is entitled to an average animal within that category. And the husband has an option. If he wants, he may give her that, or if he wants, he may give her its value. And let's also look at the next ruling because that's very closely related. If he marries her for an unspecified garment, then she is entitled to the customary dowry. So the first thing we observe is the difference in the rulings between these two scenarios. In the first one, he has these two options, and in the last one, he has to give her the customary dowry. So let's quickly explain the second one. The reason why he has to give the customary dowry is because of the major obscurity within this. So he said to her, I'm going to give you a garment as dowry. Now, a garment, as you may understand, it could be so different. So let's say he says, I'm going to give you a wedding dress. Now, this wedding dress could be £5,000. And if this garment that he is talking about is a very cheap, it could be as cheap as a £10 cloth. Now, due to this disparity, there is major obscurity. And because of this, the default sum would be due, which is the customary dowry. When you come to the first ruling, where he mentions an animal, but he doesn't specify, just because he hasn't specified doesn't mean that there is major obscurity. There is minor obscurity because he's mentioned a goat, for example. Now, yes, there are differences between different colors of goats and different breeds of goats and different ages of goats, but it's not as major obscurity as you'd find in a garment. And that's why all he has to do is nominate what he actually meant by a goat. And after he nominates, then she will be entitled to the average animal within that category. So he said a goat, then we look at the average age of that animal. We look at the average breed. How much does an average breed cost? And how much does the color between the cheapest, the price between the cheapest color and the price between the expensive color, what's the average within that? And then he can either give her that specified animal or he could give her that in its value. One question does arise, and that is, which price, what is the value that will be considered? Is the value of how much that animal cost on that day that he got married, will that be taken into account? Or is it the cost of the animal on the day that he gives her the animal or its value? So according to the preponderant view, it would be based on the cost of the animal on the marriage contract day and not on the day that he presents her the dowry. And now to wrap up, inshallah, we started off with discussing the various scenarios of providing the mut'ah, gift of gratification, to a divorcee. We said that in all scenarios, it is a recommendation to give her the gift of gratification. And only in one scenario, it's actually an obligation. And that is the scenario wherein he doesn't mention anything as the dowry, nothing has been stipulated in the marriage contract, and he happens to divorce her before marriage consummation. And then we moved on to the discussion of a man who allows his daughter or sister to get married to somebody, provided that that somebody allows his daughter or sister to get married to him. It's almost as that the dowry being that this marriage is in exchange for that marriage. So we said that such a marriage is valid, but the customary dowry would be due. And we mentioned other scenarios where the customary dowry is due. For example, a free man says that I'll give my dowry to you is my service to you. That's not going to be, the marriage will be valid, but he will need to give her the customary dowry. But we also said that if a slave did this, however, that would be valid because the slave is considered a commodity. He would not need to give her the customary dowry, rather, he'd just give her that service. And then we mentioned the ruling of when you have an insane woman and she has a father and son. Both of them can be guardians. And we mentioned the various rulings, the various views in relation to who can be her guardian and marry her off. Then we mentioned the fact that a slave cannot get married unless the master permits them to do so. And we also mentioned how the slave can give dowry and what scenarios there are within that. And we mentioned that if the master allows his slave woman to get married, he is not liable to provide her accommodation or even let her live with her husband. That's not his liability. And then we mentioned the scenario wherein a woman stipulates a certain condition on her husband and he should fulfill it. But if he doesn't fulfill it, we said that the customary dowry is due. And then we ended off with the ruling on mentioning something as dowry but not specifying the item.